We're just at 11 o'clock, so it looks like we can get started. General format for the talk I'm going to give today is that I'll walk you through an overview of WSL, go through a bunch of demos, and then leave a chunk of time at the end for questions, anything that you have for me. I'll open the floor and answer whatever I can. So with that, I'll get started. My name is Tara Raj. I'll be speaking about the Windows Subsystem for Linux today. A quick agenda. I'll talk to you about what WSL is, show you an overview of some of the basics, then explain how it works from an architectural standpoint, talk about how you can create scripts that combine WSL and PowerShell together, and then finally talk about some code editing that you can do in the command line with WSL. WSL allows you to run a Linux environment directly on Windows. You get access to your native Linux command line tools, utilities, applications, and you can access these all unmodified and directly on Linux. Why you'd want to use WSL? Well, it generally makes your life easier if you want access to things on Windows, such as your ELF64 Linux binaries. And if you have, let's say, for example, an online tutorial, and you see that it's written for someone with a Linux machine. Normally, when you have Windows, you then have to go look up a Windows-specific tutorial. But in this case, you can just copy and paste that code right into your terminal. If you're not normally a Windows user and you like Linux, well, great news. You have Linux directly there for you, and you can enjoy Windows features such as Windows ecosystem, gaming, Photoshop, whatever Windows things you might want. And so this environment really allows you to mix Windows and Linux together in a way that's comfortable and flexible for you. We like to think of it as a spectrum of we have Linux on one side and you have Windows on the other. So if you love Linux, you can just work in that environment directly, have all your files there, you can access them in your Linux way. If you love Windows, you can stay on that side and you can sit anywhere on this spectrum, where from Linux, you can launch Windows executables, and from the Windows side, you can launch Linux binaries. So it's really your choice how you want to use WSL to make your life easier. And if you want to just use Linux the entire time, you can do that too. So now I'll give you a quick demo of what WSL is and some of the basics of how to use it. So here I'm in PowerShell, and one of the first things that I'll show you. Oh. There we go. Cool. Is that text big enough for everyone to see as well? Yeah. OK, great. And so here we're in PowerShell. The first thing I'll show you to do is actually launch WSL. I do have a specific WSL instance here. I have Ubuntu 18.04. But in the spirit of being at a PowerShell summit, we'll launch it from PowerShell. So all I need to say is WSL.exe. That's the executable name for your default WSL instance. So my default is Ubuntu 18.04. So when I do that, I'm now in Ubuntu. So here I'll show you that I'm indeed in an Ubuntu instance where I'm just going to run screen fetch. And one thing that I want to point out here is what we see for the OS. So we see that is indeed Ubuntu 18.04 running natively, and we're saying that it's on Windows 10. So here when you see the kernel, you see that it's actually running on Microsoft, the Windows kernel. And I'll go into a little bit more details about that when I talk about the architecture and how this works, but we can see we have native Ubuntu. So you can take advantage of various utilities. So we have our package manager. We have apt-get. So I can run simple commands like apt-get update. In addition to that, I can use piping. And your general Linux things are just going to work. One of my favorite tools is tmux. So I can use that. And I can run a variety of things. So here I have two kind of visual demos to show you. We have a process that is continuously running, and I have htop. Something that's actually really neat about WSL is that you can run processes in the background now. And this was something that we released late last year in our fall update, that you can actually attach a background process. So now I'm going to exit out of this, close my window, open it back up, and so now I'll launch WSL again, and now when I do this and say tmux ls, you see that I still have that tmux session running. So now if I say tmux attach, we still have our processes running in the background. So from a scripting perspective, you can see how this could be super useful for you. If you want to have a script running, close your window, and go do something else, it'll still run in the background for you. So now that you actually believe that I am running Linux on Windows, I'll talk to you a little bit about how this magic works. So onto the architecture diagrams. We have two sides to the equation here. We have Linux user mode, and then we have the Windows kernel. So this is a general overview of what you just saw. We have that Ubuntu executable. I was running Ubuntu 18.04. We have a couple utilities that we also ship with WSL. So we have a config helper, as well as a WSL executable, which is a command line utility to help you better manage your instance. Then we have the kernel itself. So we have LX core sys, which allows you to interface between the kernel itself and user mode. And then we have the Windows NT kernel, which then communicates directly with LX core. So this is how WSL is paired together, with that LX core sys and the two helper tools that we have. But usually when we talk about WSL, we talk about it in this context where we are speaking about the distro itself. The distro is shipped by whoever the distro owner is. So in this case, Ubuntu is shipped by Canonical. We have Debian, Kali Linux, and a few others in the store as well. While I'm on this slide, I'll talk a little bit about how to install and how you actually get WSL. So one of the things that you need to do is go into the store. You can search for Linux, and you'll see the various distros we have. You select a distro, and then you can just go ahead and install that. The other thing you need to do is enable the optional Windows component. So one of the optional components will be the Windows Subsystem for Linux, so you can go in to that optional component and then you just enable that. It does require a system restart, so keep that in mind when you're enabling WSL. But when you do those two steps, you will get all of these components that are highlighted right now. Once you get those, and when you launch a Linux binary, what happens is we create a new session, and so that's with all of the WSL processes, and we run a custom initialization file. And so that is within the distro itself. That custom init file will launch. Each distro is able to make their own changes to that init file as well. So Kali Linux, for example, comes with a bunch of pen testing tools already in it. And so they've added that to the initialization file. You'll have bin bash, which then runs that binary in the session itself. And all of this communicates with LX core. And if you want to see bin bash running, it's actually available and visible in the task manager. When you enable the optional feature, you'll get these three components, and then when you get it from the store, you then get your distro itself. The first distro you install is your default, but you can install many distros, run them side by side, and so the other distros also available in the store. So now let's talk about the WSL config helper tool a little bit. And I'll do a quick demo of some of the things you can do with that. So the first thing is WSL config L, and that lists out the distros that you have. So right now I have Ubuntu and Debian installed. It indicates that Ubuntu 18.04 is my default. But if you want to change your default, you use the S command, and I can set my default to Debian. So now when I go back and I say list, Debian is now my default, but I like Ubuntu 18.04. So I will set that back as my default. One of the other things to point out with WSL config is that you can also unregister and re-register distros. If you do that, you will lose your data. So I'm not going to do that right now in the demo, but you can see we have a set of options here for you to use. And it's just as easy as that to go back and forth between various Linux flavors. So if you're writing an application that you're deploying to multiple versions of Linux, this is a super simple way that you can go back and forth to test that out. To go into the architecture side of what you just saw, list will list out the distros you have. So each of these distros is registered with WSL itself, and it indicates that, yes, you indeed have your distros there. Setting it will move the default over, and that's what's registered with the WSL config command line utility. As I mentioned, you can do unregister. It breaks the connection between the distro and WSL itself. So if you do that, as I mentioned, you will lose your data stored in that distro. So only do that in a sense where you're very deliberate about it. You can also re-register. So one thing that you can do is you can run a distro by its executable name. So if I say Debian.exe, for example, then that will just run Debian from PowerShell. So I'll go into a little bit more about how you can interface PowerShell with your WSL distros now. So as I had showed you before, WSL.exe puts me into my default distro. Now that I'm in WSL, if I want to go back over to PowerShell, I can call PowerShell by its executable name, which is just PowerShell. And so now I'm back in PowerShell. I can also use our WSL command line utility and say -d, which is a distro that I want to launch, and call the distro by its name itself. I can go then back into PowerShell, and then same thing, let's say I want to go into Debian. And that's how you can quickly go back and forth between your distros and your environments. Something that's kind of neat with going with various distros, so let's say now I want to go back into Ubuntu. Something that I can say is Notepad executable, and now I want to actually launch that from PowerShell. So I'm piping in the Notepad executable command into PowerShell, and so now this is actually going to open up Notepad from PowerShell for me. Or it should have. Let's see if we can do that again. There we go. And so as you can see, I've now launched Notepad, and I'm within my PowerShell context as well. And so those are some of the things you can imagine you can write much more complicated scripts that you can run through PowerShell, through WSL in a pretty simple way. We've come up with a set of scripts to help you set up your dev box in just one click. And so if you go to aka.ms/devsetup, you can see a variety of scripts. We have machine learning scripts, web development scripts, and so on. So we started this in partnership with both Box Starter and Chocolatey. So it's a set of Chocolatey scripts, and the Box Starter portion of the script will allow you to restart your machine and continue running the script. So as I had mentioned, WSL, when you first enable it, does require you to restart your machine. If you run this script, it'll restart your machine and then pick the script right back up from where you left off. So basically, if you were in a PowerShell administrator window, you Choco install the Windows Subsystem for Linux and the optional feature itself. And then you can actually install a distro from the command line as well. And so this is an example of what Ubuntu 18.04 would be. And you just add that path to the Ubuntu Apex. And so this also works as an offline installation. I'll go to the GitHub page that we have this on real quick as well, so you can see what kinds of things we have there. So we have quite a few scripts that you might want to run. So for example, we have one for web developers. And going through this script here, I can point out a couple of the things that we install. And so, for example, we're installing Hyper-V, we have Docker, WSL, we have a Firefox browser for you, since if you're doing web development, you probably want to test that as well. And that's essentially what a bunch of these scripts are. So we have some base scripts. This is the web dev script, and it's a one-click install. So once you install this script, let's say you had a new machine, it just goes through and it runs all of the things that a web developer might want in addition to WSL. So with that, the next demo that I want to show you is how you can actually edit your code with WSL. I've showed you a little bit of the scripting and management side of things. Now I want to show you getting to your code itself. So here I'm in WSL. I have a pretty simple C++ program. So I'm going to first navigate to my directory. One of the things to note here is I have this project saved on my Windows file system. So WSL essentially views that file system as if it were to be mounted. So that's what that MNT part means. And it's under my C drive, so that's the C. And so now I'm actually in my Windows file system, and I'm calling into that from WSL. You can put your files in the WSL file system as well. A couple years ago, when we first started this project, we told you not to put your files there because we did not preserve metadata between Linux files and Windows files, so there was no extended Linux file metadata support. We now have that, so you're pretty safe to save your data on either side, depending on where you prefer to work out of. So now I am going to open up my C++ program in Vim. And one of the things that I'm going to do is just change this hello world statement to make it a multi-line statement. So as you can see, super simple C++ program, editing it in Vim. And now I've saved my file. So now that I'm in WSL, one of the things that I can do is I can actually compile this with GCC. And I want to also note that previously, Notepad did not have support for Linux line endings. So if I copied and pasted that program that I just edited into Notepad about a year ago, you would just see a jumbled mess of things. The Linux line endings were not supported. But now if I open up that Hello World file in Notepad, you should be able to see it there. Notepad's just acting up on me today. Let's see if I could just pull it up from here. Here we go. So yeah, you can see it opens that up, and specifically, you'll see what kind of line endings you have at the bottom of Notepad. So it'll tell me that I have mixed line endings, I have Windows line endings, or I have Linux line endings.
Edited that in Notepad as well and preserved that?
Yes, yeah, you can go back and forth between Notepad and WSL or Vim and Notepad, and it preserves it for you. And so the last thing that I'm going to show here is actually compiling this program. So I'm going to use GCC, hello world, output that to a demo. So I compiled that, and now I'm going to run it. And it's just as simple as that. It compiles, it runs, you see the output in the terminal window. And if you have a more complicated C++ program than Hello World, it will run for a bit longer, but you still get all of those tools and utilities. So we kind of went from the beginning of this demo just showing you that, yes, Linux does indeed run on Windows. And now we're getting to the point where we're editing code, we're compiling. And so as you can see, you can really get deep with this. You can use this for your day-to-day work when you're sitting there, you're on your Windows machine and you're coding, and let's say you're deploying to a cloud instance that's running a Linux VM. You can use WSL to emulate that production environment here with your dev machine, and you don't need to spin up a VM of your own. You don't need to run parallels. This is a dirt simple way that you can get Linux running on your machine and do things quickly. So with that, that's basically all I had to share with you guys. What we learned today is an overview of WSL, some of the basics. We went into the architecture, and we just touched the surface with that, but I'm happy to answer more questions about it if you have more. Interoperability, moving between PowerShell and WSL, and finally, editing code. So if you're interested in installing WSL, I have a bunch of resources on this slide that you can go to read up more. Follow our blogs. We post on that periodically whenever we have updates to share of the new features. So the background sessions, for example, that's something that we blogged about as soon as we flighted it to the Windows Insiders build. And we have a pretty active GitHub repo where people file thousands of issues and give us requests of what they want. So if there's something that isn't particularly what you expected, or you want something more and have a feature request, our GitHub repo is a great way to provide us with that. So with that, I'll open the floor to questions. Thanks, everyone.